It's 3 o'clock on the East Coast, noon on the West Coast. I'm Shepard Smith in New York. The defense secretary announces he may be sending even more special ops forces to target the Islamic State in Iraq and in Syria.
These special operators will over time be able to conduct raids, free hostages, gather intelligence, and capture ISIL leaders.
Ahead, a special forces command vet on why he says this is the best strategy and shift in strategy he's seen in months, and what he says needs to happen next if this doesn't succeed. Plus, the Russian leader Vladimir Putin moving more of his forces to Syria, while President Obama tries to convince Russia and Turkey to turn down the tension. Also, is it okay for us to rewrite our DNA? A new technique could potentially stop some of the worst genetic diseases, but it may come with hidden consequences for all of humanity. Ahead, the debate over editing our genes. Let's get to it.
Now, Shepard Smith reporting live from the Fox News deck.
First from the Fox News deck this Tuesday afternoon, mission creep accomplished. President Obama, who once called it a, quote, profound mistake, unquote, to put boots on the ground in Iraq and Syria, is doing now exactly that. Not sending troops only to assist and advise local forces, as he first said in the first wave of this mission creep, but instead in this new chapter of mission creep, putting Americans on the ground to fight ISIS unilaterally, all on their own. In other words, we're doing exactly what ISIS leaders openly begged America to do. And already some powerful militant groups are promising to make American troops their number one target. The Defense Secretary Ash Carter announced the deployments today to Congress. He said the president is ordering special operations forces to fight ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Part of their mission, work alongside local forces. But now the troops will be ready to conduct raids on their own. This is a major escalation in the United States' involvement there. Secretary Carter did not give specific numbers. There are widespread reports of about 200, but we can't confirm them. Still, the secretary did tell one congresswoman the 50 or so troops to which they've already admitted is just the beginning.
That's for starters. If we find more forces that we can enable in this way, we're prepared to do more. I think the chairman and I have repeatedly said that. We're prepared to do more. I have every reason to believe the president will allow us to do more and authorize us to do more when we have more opportunities.
But authorization comes from the Congress. And from the Congress, we have heard not one single word. This is, though, a huge shift in the United States strategy against ISIS, and about face that's played out over 2 years. 2 years of saying one thing and then doing another. In 2013, the President of the United States said, quote, in no event are we considering any kind of military action that would involve boots on the ground, unquote. A year later, the President addressed the nation on the mission in Syria, quoting, it will not involve American combat troops fighting on foreign soil. Then in October of this year, word that the Pentagon was sending some special forces to Syria, only in a limited role to advise and assist the locals. Advise and assist. Remember that phrase. President Obama said at the time that he did not break his promise not to put boots on the ground, but of course he did. And he said we'd already been out helping the local forces and Americans would not be fighting on the front lines. Now that's changed. So what's the explanation now that he's sending U.S. forces ready to fight on their own? So far, we have not a single word from President Obama, not one. But we are hearing from two powerful terror groups, not ISIS, but its Shia enemies, who tell the Reuters news agency they will chase down Americans in Iraq. Quote, we fought them before, and we're ready to resume fighting. Doug McElway on Fox Top Story live at the Pentagon. What led to this latest chapter of mission creep?
Well, Shep, it's basically the hard, cold reality on the ground. We heard it again today when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joe Dunford, told the House Armed Services Committee that ISIS is not contained. That in direct contrast to the president's statement on the day before the Paris attacks that ISIS was indeed contained. Also today, other Western allies are moving to a more aggressive posture against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Germany, for example, considering putting up to 1,200 boots on the ground, as well as provide reconnaissance and refueling aircraft and a naval frigate to help protect the French aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle, which is now on station, I should say. Britain's parliament is also set to vote tomorrow on airstrikes in Syria. With the coalition resolve apparently strengthening, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter today announced several new measures. The U.S. will open a second front in the south of Syria using 50 additional special forces. It will deploy what Carter called a specialized expeditionary targeting force of 200 special ops troops to assist Iraqi and Kurdish Peshmerga forces to the north. That force will likely include JTACs, the embedded U.S. ground forces with lasers to guide smart munitions accurately to their target. And that's just one of the roles, which will include targeted assassinations of ISIS leaders.
We have the long reach that no one else has. And it puts everybody on notice in Syria that you don't know at night who's going to be coming in the window.
The U.S. has in recent days been stepping up its targeting while relaxing some rules of engagement. For instance, 400 oil trucks were recently hit by the United States. The president had earlier prohibited strikes on that kind of oil infrastructure for fear of environmental damage and damage to the infrastructure for when citizens would ultimately return to Syria. Shep, back to you.
Doug McElway, if they do. Thank you. Let's bring in Lieutenant Colonel Mitch Utterback. He's a veteran of the United States Army Special Forces, now serves in the Colorado National Guard. Sir, thank you for your service and welcome.
Thanks, Shep. I'm actually retired fully from the military service, including the Guard now.
Well, congratulations. You like this change. Why?
Well, Shep, it's actually bringing our special forces into the mission that they were designed for over 50 years ago. The unique capabilities of our special forces, especially Army Special Forces, are really perfect for the fight that the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs have described this morning.
And if, for instance, 5 or 10 of them are taken hostage and their heads cut off in a familiar snuff video, do we then send in the cavalry? Is it 50,000 then or 100,000? And how do we make those decisions as the mission creep continues?
Well, Shep, I have to tell you, this is probably personally, there hasn't been a Special Forces guy captured, and there probably will never be, because we're going to go down fighting to the death, or our buddies are going to make sure that never happens. So that's a terrible possibility it could happen, but every guy in the Special Forces has promised to his brothers in arms, that will never happen to me.
The president promised us he wouldn't put boots on the ground until he put boots on the ground when he promised he wouldn't send more, and now he's sending more. What is to assure the American people that we're not giving ISIS exactly what ISIS demanded when it started this campaign, when it said, please come over and let's fight a war of civilizations, because that's exactly what we want, and if you would, we would love that. Thank you.
Shep, the president's, they're sending the Special Forces in small enough numbers, and unfortunately this is a lazy vernacular of the White House and the Pentagon. Boots on the ground, really everybody should know, means large combat formations. The 82nd from Fort Bragg, the 4th Infantry from Fort Carson. Special Operations Forces don't really count, unfortunately, in that boots on the ground tally. And there's never going to be a large enough number that our government can say we have large combat formations on the ground. I think we're going to keep the soft footprint small, both in Iraq and Syria.
Well, I thought we were going to keep it to 0 because that's what the president promised us. He promised us 0 boots on the ground. Sir, you further say that you think that now the Shia and Sunni divide is going to be solved diplomatically. Is that right?
Well, Secretary Carter today said the first line of effort in our national strategy to defeat ISIS is diplomacy. Diplomacy, the SecDef said, has to resolve the Syrian civil war, and diplomacy within Iraq also has to resolve that serious Shia sectarianism that's overtaken the Iraqi government.
Our diplomacy will solve a civil war and a conflict between 2 religious sects that began in the 7th century.
That was the SecDef this morning, turning it over to Secretary Kerry and the State Department as #1 in our line of effort. Yeah,
to talk it through and see if we can't get those 2 enemies who've been fighting since before we were a nation to come together, because the people from the West think it's a great idea. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I agree with you.
I remember hearing, not that very long ago that, we'd be greeted as liberators and that this was going to work out just great, and weapons of mass destruction and yellow cake from Niger. And every time we take another step, it seems like we're doing something that the moderate rebels in Syria who were going to fight and win this, and there turned out to be a grand total of 0 of them. You just wonder, when all of this rhetoric that turns out to mean nothing, 0 boots on the ground, no troops, not going to go do what ISIS wants, you wonder when all that'll come together and America will go, You keep not telling us the truth, and you keep sending our men home dead by the thousands. When at some point do we go, we need a real strategy here that doesn't involve what ISIS demands?
Well said, Shep. You just explained the Pentagon and the White House is not really doing a great job with strategic messaging, continually having to go back and forth with what they said they were going to do and what we're doing now. And you're one of the best at bringing to the American public, hey, this is what they said and this is what we're doing. It may be time to introduce or call back to active duty in an ambassadorial capacity some of the men who led the fight against al-Qaeda in Iraq 10 years ago.
That's interesting. Mitch Utterback, a lieutenant colonel, retired, United States Army Special Forces. Again, thank you so much. It's nice to talk to you. I appreciate it. One of those airstrikes in Syria left millions of people without any water. That's according to the United Nations. The bomb exploded in a northern Syrian city called Aleppo. You may have heard of it. It hit a water treatment plant and cut water flow to some 3.5 million people. The United Nations reports crews have since restarted the pumps, but that more than 1 million people still have a reduced water supply. Syria's government-run media blames the United States-led coalition for the bombing. But a human rights group says the strike came from the forces of the murderous dictator Bashar al-Assad.